My house was built sometime in the 1970s, so it isn't exactly new, but it isn't especially old either. My family moved here in the early 2000s, and as far as I know, we never really learned much about the house's history. For years, we've joked that the place might be haunted. Doors would suddenly slam, the house would creak at strange times, and things would occasionally disappear without explanation. We always blamed those things on ghosts as a joke, and nobody really took it seriously. But about 5 years ago, whatever was happening in the house seemed to become a little more noticeable. We started hearing what sounded like light footsteps moving through the hallway. There were also scratching sounds coming from the second floor, and sometimes from inside the walls. We didn't have any problems with mice or other rodents, so there wasn't an obvious explanation for the noises. That was probably what made them more unsettling. Everyone in the family could hear them, but none of us could figure out where they were coming from. Then, around 3 or 4 years ago, something happened while I was home alone. I was sitting in the living room when I suddenly heard an incredibly loud bang from upstairs. It was so powerful that my first thought was that one of the upstairs cabinets had fallen over. At the exact moment I heard it, the lights flickered and the television shut off before coming back on. I could even feel the vibration from downstairs. I immediately went upstairs to see what had happened. But everything looked completely normal. Nothing had fallen, nothing was damaged, and there wasn't anything obvious that could have made such a loud impact. The strange part is that this happened several times afterward, and every incident followed almost the exact same pattern. There would be a huge bang, the house would shake slightly, the lights would flicker, and then I would go upstairs and find absolutely nothing wrong. Even stranger, the sound seems to behave differently, depending on where you are in the house. You can hear the bang clearly from downstairs, but apparently you can't hear it when you're actually upstairs. I've even had people call me on the phone asking why I was slamming doors so hard when I was actually lying completely still in my bed. Then, during the past year, I started seeing things that I can't really explain. I don't know if they were actual apparitions or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but one moment in particular has stayed with me. I was looking into my brother's bedroom and saw what appeared to be a small toddler sleeping on his bed. I could see her very clearly. She looked around 3 years old and had long blonde hair. One of her arms was hanging over the side of the bed. I remember being confused more than frightened at first, because I assumed there was a simple explanation. But when I walked closer to her, she suddenly disappeared. That happened about a year ago, and even now thinking about it still makes me uncomfortable. Then, a few weeks ago, I encountered what seemed to be the same little girl again. I was home alone when I heard someone knock on the front door. I wasn't expecting anybody, so I immediately wondered who could possibly be there. As I walked toward the hallway, I heard the door closing, followed by a young girl's voice saying hello. She said it in my native language, and the way she said it sounded almost casual, like a child who had just walked into her own home and was announcing that she had arrived. I immediately felt a chill run down my back. Still, I opened the door to check. My brother is 5 years old, so I thought maybe he had somehow come home earlier than expected. But when I looked outside, there was nobody there. Then today, something else happened. I closed one of the doors properly and walked away. A little later, I noticed that the door had opened slightly again. I looked directly at it, and somehow it slowly closed itself. Since then, I've also been hearing more banging sounds coming from downstairs, and honestly, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do about any of this. There's another strange detail that might be connected, although I can't prove it. Whenever I sleep in this house, my dreams seem much more vivid than they are when I'm somewhere else. Sometimes I wake up and find that my sheets or blanket have been pulled off my bed during the night. I already sleep restlessly here, so waking up like that doesn't exactly help. I've tried talking to whatever might be here. For a while, it actually seemed to become quieter, almost as if it had listened. But eventually the noises started again, which is why I'm beginning to wonder if something else is going on in this house. I'm probably going to disagree with most people and say that what happened in my old house may actually have involved spirits. I once owned a home that had been built in the early 1700s, and during the time I lived there, I became convinced that we had several different presences around us. I believe there were at least 3 separate entities. One appeared to be a Puritan woman, which seemed fitting considering that we lived in Massachusetts, not far from the region associated with the Pilgrims. Another seemed to be a man who looked like some kind of overseer. I would see him wearing leather-soled boots, a buttoned shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. He would sometimes stand watching me while I worked in the garden, or even while I was lying in bed. But there was also another presence, and that one was different from the others. She was the one who eventually became openly threatening, especially toward my young daughter. Before deciding what I thought was happening, I started researching the property itself. What I discovered was surprisingly interesting. Our house had once been part of a much larger estate belonging to a captain, and the building we lived in had originally been a carriage house. There were physical traces of that history scattered around the property. I found pieces of metal that appeared to have come from bits or harnesses buried in the ground, along with fragments of pottery and pieces of china. The records from that period were limited, so most of what I could find only documented the property changing hands or being divided into smaller sections. There was also an old stone boundary wall that ran directly through our yard. Nearby was a hitching post that appeared to have survived from the property's earlier days. The more I researched, the easier it became to imagine what the land might have looked like centuries earlier. At first, though, the house itself felt peaceful. It was quiet, comfortable, and honestly a lovely place to live. Nothing seemed particularly strange during the beginning of our time there. Then, about a month after moving in, the activity began. The first presence to make itself known was the Puritan woman. I would sometimes see her moving through the front doors and passing in and out of the pantry. Eventually, we discovered that the pantry had once been another entrance to the house. The original steps had been buried long ago, but the history of the doorway explained why that area seemed significant. Around the same time, I began finding boxes of food scattered across the floor. They weren't simply knocked over near where they had been sitting. They would sometimes be found several feet away from their original positions, as if someone had deliberately moved them. Then there was the man. He seemed less interested in making noise and more interested in watching us. I could hear what sounded like footsteps crossing the wide wooden floors and continuing toward our bedroom. That room had apparently once been used as sleeping quarters for the stable workers. Whenever I sensed him nearby, I had the strange impression that he was judging everything we did. Even outside, while I was working in the yard, I could sometimes feel as though someone was standing behind me and watching. There were moments when I could actually sense footsteps approaching, only to turn around and find absolutely nobody there. He would occasionally make himself visible inside the house as well, especially when we were in bed. We would hear heavy bangs from upstairs, almost like something had fallen onto the floor, but when we investigated, nothing had moved. There weren't even doors nearby that could have slammed shut. But the old woman was the one who caused the biggest problems. She seemed to remain near the fireplaces, but she appeared to prefer the one located in my daughter's room. She would sometimes wake my daughter violently during the night. My daughter would describe seeing the woman crouched near the fireplace, staring directly at her. There was a feeling of hostility surrounding her, almost as though she resented us for being in what she considered to be her space. At times, the sounds she made were almost like a powerful windstorm. It wasn't just an occasional noise. There was an intensity to it that made the whole situation difficult to ignore. especially because a young child was involved. I eventually started blessing the house using herbs. Surprisingly, that seemed to calm the old woman down. The activity would decrease for a while, and the house would become quieter. But the peace never lasted. Whenever the full moon arrived, the activity seemed to become stronger again. Eventually, I began using sage with all of the windows open. I told the spirits that they didn't necessarily have to leave, but they needed to coexist with us peacefully and respectfully. That approach seemed to work with 2 of them. The old woman, however, reacted very differently. She seemed to become even more hostile, almost as though she resented being told what to do. So I eventually tried Palo Santo instead. I made it very clear that she needed to leave us alone, especially my daughter. I told her that if she couldn't coexist peacefully with us, then she would have to leave. I also told her that there was something especially cruel about frightening a child who was only around 4 years old. After that, something changed. I never saw the old woman again. This might sound like a long shot, but I genuinely believe there is something strange about my house. Ever since I was young, unusual things seemed to happen around me. My mother would sometimes find me awake in the middle of the night, sitting in the same place and talking to the wall, as though someone was standing there listening to me. As I grew older, the thing happening around the house became increasingly difficult to explain. One of the earliest things I remember is the basement. I've been terrified of going down there for as long as I can remember. There's a heavy feeling in that part of the house that I've never been able to properly describe. It isn't just ordinary fear. Being down there always made me feel as though something was wrong. Sometimes objects would fall over without anyone touching them. Other times, I would catch something moving quickly through the corner of my eye, almost as though someone had sprinted past me. But whenever I turned around to look, there was nothing there. There was another incident when I was falling asleep on the couch with a friend. Without warning, I felt someone tugging lightly on my hair. I immediately turned around because I was certain someone had to be standing behind me. But when I looked, there was nobody there. I've also been seeing what I can only describe as shadow figures for most of my life. For years, I tried telling myself that they were simply products of my imagination. Maybe it was poor lighting, exhaustion, or my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I got older, I noticed something that bothered me. The figure never seemed to change. It would appear in different areas of the house, but it always looked like the same thing. I still remember the first time I saw it clearly. I was lying in bed one night when I looked past my bedroom doorway. Across the hall, near another doorway, there was a massive dark figure standing completely still. It was extremely tall and unnaturally thin. It was so tall that it almost looked as though it would have to bend itself just to fit underneath the ceiling. I remember telling my dad about it the next morning. He has never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything paranormal, so I expected him to dismiss the whole thing immediately. Instead, he became quiet. After I described exactly what I had seen, he admitted that he had seen the same figure before. He believes it was only a trick of the light. I don't believe that. There have been other strange encounters too. One night, I walked into my bedroom when the lights were off and saw something black moving rapidly across the floor. At first, I assumed it was one of my dogs. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But then the thing disappeared underneath my bed. There was one problem with that explanation. My dogs are extremely large. They physically cannot fit underneath my bed. Even so, I called for them. Both dogs immediately came running into the room from the living room. That was when I realized whatever had gone underneath my bed couldn't have been either of them. The most frightening experience happened when my sister and I were home alone. She kept walking nervously into the kitchen, and eventually I asked her what was wrong. She told me she could hear footsteps slowly approaching the stairs. At first, I didn't believe her. I went to listen for myself. Then I heard them. Heavy footsteps. There were also loud banging sounds, and the footsteps were slowly making their way up the stairs directly toward us. It sounded so convincing that I immediately thought someone had broken into the house. I panicked and grabbed a knife. My sister and I rushed into the bathroom and locked the door behind us. Then we stood there silently, listening to whatever was moving around outside. The footsteps continued through the hallway. At times, it sounded as though the person was pacing back and forth just outside the bathroom. We stayed there, completely frozen, until we finally heard the front door slam shut. For a moment, we thought that meant the person had left. Certain that whoever had entered the house was gone, we called our grandmother and asked her to come over. When she eventually knocked on the front door, my sister and I just looked at each other. Something didn't make sense. We had already heard the front door slam. When we finally came out of the bathroom and checked the house, both exterior doors were still locked. No one else had a key. That meant whatever we had heard moving through the house couldn't have been a normal intruder. And that realization was difficult to ignore.